Chapter 5 of The House of a Thousand Candles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The House of a Thousand Candles by Meredith Nicholson. Chapter 5. A Red Tam-o'-Shanter. I looked out on the bright October morning with a renewed sense of isolation. Trees crowded about my windows, many of them still wearing their festal colors, scarlet and brown and gold, with the bright green of some sulking companion standing out here and there with startling vividness. I put on an old corduroy outing suit and heavy shoes, ready for a tramp abroad, and went below. The great library seemed larger than ever when I beheld it in the morning light. I opened one of the French windows and stepped out onto a stone terrace, where I gained a fair view of the exterior of the house, which proved to be a modified Tudor, with battlements and two towers. One of the latter was only half finished, and to it and other parts of the house the workmen's scaffolding still clung. Heaps of stone and piles of lumber were scattered about in great disorder. The house extended partly along the edge of a ravine, through which a slender creek ran toward the lake. The terrace became a broad balcony immediately outside the library, and beneath it the water bubbled pleasantly around heavy stone pillars. Two pretty rustic bridges spanned the ravine, one near the front entrance, the other at the rear. My grandfather had begun his house on a generous plan, but buried as it was among the trees, it suffered from lack of perspective. However, on one side toward the lake was a fair meadow, broken by a water tower, and just beyond the west dividing wall I saw a little chapel, and still farther, in the same direction, the outlines of the buildings of St. Agatha's were vaguely perceptible in another strip of woodland. The thought of gentle nuns and schoolgirls as neighbors amused me. All I asked was that they should keep to their own side of the wall. I heard behind me the careful step of Bates. "Good morning, Mr. Glenarm. I trust you rested quite well, sir." His figure was as austere, his tone as respectful and colorless as by night. The morning light gave him a pallid cast. He suffered my examination coolly enough. His eyes were, indeed, the best thing about him. "This is what Mr. Glenarm called the platform. I believe it's in Hamlet, sir." I laughed aloud. Elsinore, a platform before the castle. "It was one of Mr. Glenarm's little fancies, you might call it, sir." "And the ghost? Where does the murdered majesty of Denmark lie by day?" "I fear it has not been provided, sir. As you see, Mr. Glenarm, the house is quite incomplete. My late master had not carried out all his plans." Bates did not smile. I fancied he never smiled, and I wondered whether John Marshall Glenarm had played upon the man's lack of humor. My grandfather had been possessed of a certain grim, ironical gift at jesting, and quite likely he had amused himself by experimenting upon his serving man. "You may breakfast when you like, sir." And thus admonished, I went into the refectory. A newspaper lay at my plate. It was the morning's issue of a Chicago daily. I was, then, not wholly out of the world, I reflected, scanning the headlines. "Your grandfather rarely examined the paper. Mr. Glenarm was more particularly interested in the old times. He wasn't what you might call up to date, if you will pardon the expression, sir." "You are quite right about that, Bates. He was a medievalist in his sympathies." "Thank you for that word, sir. I've frequently heard him apply it to himself. The plain omelette was a great favorite with your grandfather. I hope it is to your liking, sir." "It's excellent, Bates, and your coffee is beyond praise." "Thank you, Mr. Glenarm. One does what one can, sir." He had placed me so that I faced the windows, an attention to my comfort and safety which I appreciated. The broken pane told the tale of the shot that had so narrowly missed me the night before. "I'll repair that to-day, sir," Bates remarked, seeing my eyes upon the window. "You know that I am to spend a year on this place. I assume that you understand the circumstances?" I said, feeling it wise that we should understand each other. "Quite so, Mr. Glenarm." "I'm a student, you know, and all I want is to be left alone." This I threw in to reassure myself rather than for his information. It was just as well, I reflected, to assert a little authority, even though the fellow undoubtedly represented Pickering and received orders from him. "In a day or two, as soon as I have got used to the place, I shall settle down to work in the library. You may give me breakfast at 7:30, luncheon at 1:30, and dinner at 7. "Those were my late master's hours, sir." "Very good. And I'll eat anything you please except mutton broth, meat pie, and canned strawberries. Strawberries in tins, Bates, are not well calculated to lift the spirit of man." "I quite agree with you, sir, if you will pardon my opinion." "And the bills?" "They are provided for by Mr. Pickering. He sends me an allowance for the household expenses." "So you are to report to him, are you, as heretofore?" I blew out a match with which I had lighted a cigar and watched the smoking end intently. "I believe that's the idea, sir." It is not pleasant to be under compulsion, to feel your freedom curtailed, to be conscious of espionage. I rose without a word and went into the hall. "You may like to have the keys. There's 2 for the gates in the outer wall and 1 for the St. Agatha's gate. They're marked, as you see. And here's the hall door key and the boathouse key that you asked for last night." After an hour spent in unpacking, I went out into the grounds. I had thought it well to wire Pickering of my arrival, and I set out for Annandale to send him a telegram. My spirit lightened under the influences of the crisp air and cheering sunshine. What had seemed strange and shadowy at night was clear enough by day. I found the gate through which we had entered the grounds the night before without difficulty. The stone wall was assuredly no flimsy thing. It was built in a thoroughly workmanlike manner, and I mentally computed its probable cost with amazement. There were, I reflected, much more satisfactory ways of spending money than in building walls around Indiana forests. But the place was mine, or as good as mine, and there was no manner of use in quarreling with the whims of my dead grandfather. At the expiration of a year I could tear down the wall if I pleased, and as to the incomplete house, that I should sell or remodel to my liking. On the whole, I settled into an amiable state of mind. My perplexity over the shot of the night before was passing away under the benign influences of blue sky and warm sunshine. A few farm folk passed me in the highway and gave me good morning in the fashion of the country, inspecting my knickerbockers at the same time with frank disapproval. I reached the lake and gazed out upon its quiet waters with satisfaction. At the foot of Annandale's main street was a dock where several small steam craft and a number of catboats were being dismantled for the winter. As I passed, a man approached the dock in a skiff, landed and tied his boat. He started toward the village at a quick pace, but turned and eyed me with rustic directness. "Good morning," I said. "Any ducks about?" "Nope, not enough to pay for the trouble." "I'm sorry for that. I'd hoped to pick up a few." "I guess you're a stranger in these parts," he remarked, eyeing me again, my knickerbockers no doubt marking me as an alien. "Quite so. My name is Glenarm, and I've just come." "I thought you might be him. We've rather been expecting you here in the village. I'm John Morgan, caretaker of the resorters' houses up the lake." "I suppose you all knew my grandfather hereabouts?" "Well, yes, you might say as we did, or you might say as we didn't. He wasn't just the sort you got next to in a hurry. He kept pretty much to himself. He built a wall there to keep us out, but he needn't have troubled himself. We're not the kind round here to meddle, and you may be sure the summer people never bothered him." There was a tone of resentment in his voice, and I hastened to say, "I'm sure you're mistaken about the purposes of that wall. My grandfather was a student of architecture. It was a hobby of his. The house and wall were in the line of his experiments, and to please his whims. I hope the people of the village won't hold any hard feelings against his memory or against me. Why, the labor there must have been a good thing for the people hereabouts." "It ought to have been," said the man gruffly, "but that's where the trouble comes in. He bought a lot of queer fellows here under contract to work for him, Italians or Greeks or some sort of foreigners. They built the wall, and he had them at work inside for half a year. He didn't even let them out for air, and when they finished his job he loaded them onto the train one day and hauled them away." "That was quite like him, I'm sure," I said, remembering with amusement my grandfather's secretive ways. "I guess he was a crank all right," said the man conclusively. It was evident that he did not care to establish friendly relations with the resident of Glenarm. He was about 40, light, with a yellow beard and pale blue eyes. He was dressed roughly and wore a shabby soft hat. "Well, I suppose I'll have to assume responsibility for him and his acts," I remarked, piqued by the fellow's surliness. We had reached the center of the village, and he left me abruptly, crossing the street to one of the shops. I continued on to the railway station, where I wrote and paid for my message. The station master inspected me carefully as I searched my pockets for change. "You want your telegrams delivered at the house?" he asked. "Yes, please," I answered, and he turned away to his desk of clicking instruments without looking at me again. It seemed wise to establish relations with the post office, so I made myself known to the girl who stood at the delivery window. "You already have a box," she advised me. "There's a boy carries the mail to your house. Mr. Bates hires him." Bates had himself given me this information, but the girl seemed to find pleasure in imparting it with a certain severity. I then bought a cake of soap at the principal drug store and purchased a package of smoking tobacco, which I did not need, at a grocery. News of my arrival had evidently reached the villagers. I was conceited enough to imagine that my presence was probably of interest to them. But the station master, the girl at the post office, and the clerks in the shops treated me with an unmistakable cold reserve. There was a certain evenness of the chill which they visited upon me, as though a particular degree of frigidity had been determined in advance. I shrugged my shoulders and turned toward Glenarm. My grandfather had left me a cheerful legacy of distrust among my neighbors, the result, probably, of importing foreign labor to work on his house. The surly Morgan had intimated as much, but it did not greatly matter. I had not come to Glenarm to cultivate the rustics, but to fulfill certain obligations laid down in my grandfather's will. I was, so to speak, on duty, and I much preferred that the villagers should let me alone. Comforting myself with these reflections, I reached the wharf, where I saw Morgan sitting with his feet dangling over the water, smoking a pipe. I nodded in his direction, but he feigned not to see me. A moment later he jumped into his boat and rowed out into the lake. When I returned to the house, Bates was at work in the kitchen. This was a large square room with heavy timbers showing in the walls and low ceiling. There was a great fireplace having an enormous chimney, and fitted with a crane and bobs, but for practical purposes a small range was provided. Bates received me placidly. "Yes, it's an unusual kitchen, sir. Mr. Glenarm copied it from an old kitchen in England. He took quite a pride in it. It's a pleasant place to sit in the evening, sir." He showed me the way below, where I found that the cellar extended under every part of the house, and was divided into large chambers. The door of one of them was of heavy oak, bound in iron, with a barred opening at the top. A great iron hasp with a heavy padlock and grilled area windows gave further the impression of a cell, and I fear that at this, as at many other things in the curious house, I swore, if I did not laugh, thinking of the money my grandfather had expended in realizing his whims. The room was used, I noted with pleasure, as a depository for potatoes. I asked Bates whether he knew my grandfather's purpose in providing a cell in his house. "That, sir, was another of the dead master's ideas. He remarked to me once that it was just as well to have a dungeon in a well-appointed house, his humor again, sir. And it comes in quite handy for the potatoes." In another room I found a curious collection of lanterns of every conceivable description, grouped on shelves, and next door to this was a storeroom filled with brass candlesticks of many odd designs. I shall not undertake to describe my sensations as, peering about with a candle in my hand, the vagaries of John Marshall Glenarm's mind were further disclosed to me. It was almost beyond belief that any man with such whims should ever have had the money to gratify them. I returned to the main floor and studied the titles of the books in the library, finally smoking a pipe over a very tedious chapter in an exceedingly dull work on Norman revivals and influences. Then I went out, assuring myself that I should get steadily to work in a day or two. It was not yet 11 o'clock, and time was sure to move deliberately within the stone walls of my prison. The long winter lay before me in which I must study perforce, and just now it was pleasant to view the landscape in all its autumn splendor. Bates was soberly chopping wood at a rough pile of timber at the rear of the house. His industry had already impressed me. He had the quiet ways of an ideal serving man. "Well, Bates, you don't intend to let me freeze to death, do you? There must be enough in that pile there to last all winter." "Yes, sir. I am just cutting a little more of the hickory, sir. Mr. Glenarm always preferred it to beech or maple. We only take out the old timber. The summer storms eat into the wood pretty bad, sir." "Oh, hickory, to be sure. I've heard it's the best firewood. That's very thoughtful of you." I turned next to the unfinished tower in the meadow, from which a windmill pumped water to the house. The iron frame was not wholly covered with stone, but material for the remainder of the work lay scattered at the base. I went on through the wood to the lake and inspected the boathouse. It was far more pretentious than I had imagined from my visit in the dark. It was of 2 stories, the upper half being a cozy lounging room with wide windows and a fine outlook over the water. The unplastered walls were hung with Indian blankets. Lounging chairs and a broad seat under the windows, colored matting on the floor, and a few prints pinned upon the Navajos gave further color to the place. I followed the pebbly shore to the stone wall where it marked the line of the school grounds. The wall, I observed, was of the same solid character here as along the road. I tramped beside it, reflecting that my grandfather's estate, in the heart of the Republic, would some day give the lie to foreign complaints that we have no ruins in America. I had assumed that there was no opening in the wall, but halfway to the road I found an iron gate, fastened with chain and padlock, by means of which I climbed to the top. The pillars at either side of the gate were of huge dimensions and were higher than I could reach. An intelligent forester had cleared the wood in the school grounds, which were of the same general character as the Glenarm estate. The little Gothic church near at hand was built of stone similar to that used in Glenarm House. As I surveyed the scene, a number of young women came from one of the school buildings, and forming in 2s and 4s, walked back and forth in a rough path that led to the chapel. A sister clad in a brown habit lingered near or walked first with one and then another of the students. It was all very pretty and interesting, and not at all the ugly school for paupers I had expected to find. The students were not the charity children I had carelessly pictured. They were not so young, for one thing, and they seemed to be apparelled decently enough. I smiled to find myself adjusting my scarf and straightening my collar, as I beheld my neighbors for the first time. As I sat thus on the wall, I heard the sound of angry voices back of me on the Glenarm side, and a crash of underbrush marked a flight and pursuit. I crouched down on the wall and waited. In a moment a man plunged through the wood and stumbled over a low-hanging vine and fell, not 10 yards from where I lay. To my great surprise it was Morgan, my acquaintance of the morning. He rose, cursed his ill luck, and hugging the wall close, ran toward the lake. Instantly the pursuer broke into view. It was Bates, evidently much excited, and with an ugly cut across his forehead. He carried a large club, and after listening for a moment for sounds of the enemy, he hurried after the caretaker. It was not my row, though I must say it quickened my curiosity. I straightened myself out, threw my legs over the school side of the wall, and lighted a cigar, feeling cheered by the opportunity the stone barricade offered for observing the world. As I looked off toward the little church I found 2 other actors appearing on the scene. A girl stood in the little opening of the wood, talking to a man. Her hands were thrust into the pockets of her covert coat. She wore a red tam-o'-shanter that made a bright bit of color in the wood. They were not more than 20 feet away, but a wild growth of young maples lay between us, screening the wall. Their profiles were toward me, and the tones of the girl's voice reached me clearly as she addressed her companion. He wore a clergyman's high waistcoat, and I assumed that he was the chaplain whom Bates had mentioned. I am not by nature an eavesdropper, but the girl was clearly making a plea of some kind, and the chaplain's stalwart figure awoke in me an antagonism that held me to the wall. "If he comes here I shall go away, so you may as well understand it and tell him. I shan't see him under any circumstances, and I'm not going to Florida or California or anywhere else in a private car, no matter who chaperones it." "Certainly not, unless you want to. Certainly not," said the chaplain. "You understand that I am only giving you his message. He thought it best—" "Not to write me or Sister Theresa," interrupted the girl contemptuously. "What a clever man he is!" "And how unclever I am," said the clergyman, laughing. "Well, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to present his message." She smiled, nodded, and turned swiftly toward the school. The chaplain looked after her for a few moments, then walked away soberly toward the lake. He was a young fellow, clean-shaven and dark, with a pair of shoulders that gave me a twinge of envy. I could not guess how great a factor that vigorous figure was to be in my own affairs. As I swung down from the wall and walked toward Glenarm House, my thoughts were not with the athletic chaplain, but with the girl, whose youth was, I reflected, marked by her short skirt, the unconcern with which her hands were thrust into the pockets of her coat, and the irresponsible tilt of the tam-o'-shanter. There is something jaunty, a suggestion of spirit and independence in a tam-o'-shanter, particularly a red one. If the red tam-o'-shanter expressed, so to speak, the keynote of St. Agatha's, The proximity of the school was not so bad a thing after all. In high good humor and with a sharp appetite, I went in to luncheon. Chapter 6